Chapter 1 Webs. Rain woke with a start. Waiting for his eyes to adjust to the darkness, he sat up and looked around the room. Was it a noise that had awakened him, or was it in his dream? The faint glow of a new morning began painting shadows in the room. Next to the door, there was movement. A pair of gray eyes reflected what little light there was before blinking out again. Rain sat back. The noise must have been in his dream. Coda may have been an older dog, but he would not allow anything within 100 paces of the house without waking the dead. Rain shrugged at that last thought. The young man laid his head back down for a few more moments, trying to recall his dream. He had strange ones lately, and so real. But he could not place this one. Rain pushed on his forehead with his fingers. More light crept into the room. Damn. The comfort of his bed made it difficult to get up, but he needed to be gone by now, or he would never get there in time. He pushed aside his blankets, rousing Coda, who came right to his side. It was colder than he anticipated, but the chill in the air didn't bother him. He welcomed it. It would make his trip easier. Hastily getting dressed, he grabbed some bread and a few pieces of dried meat that he had left out the night before, then stuffed them into his pack. On the sill there was a sweetened roll the innkeeper's wife had given to him for helping her carry some wood. He would have saved it for after dinner, but with a late start he would be lucky to be back by dark. Taking a quick bite, he added the rest to his pack as well. He lifted his cloak off the hook next to the door, then paused and put it back. The cold would not last, and his cloak would only slow him down. He would run the trail to make up the time and keep the chill off. Rain grabbed his unstrung bow and quiver and opened the door to head out. Coda darted through the door and disappeared for a few moments as Rain readied himself. The dog was soon back at his side. Rain bent down and scratched the back of Coda's head. He gave a low, moaning growl and went limp. Falling to the ground, the dog flipped to his back. Coda's sable fur was shades lighter on his underbelly. Rain scratched the dog's chest for a few moments and gave him a few quick pats, then stood up to begin his journey. The wolf-like dog followed suit, clearly eager for another hunting adventure. "Not today, boy," Rain stated with a firm voice, pointing at the dog. "Stay here." Coda sat for a few moments looking at him with a tilted head, then ran off back toward the house. Rain watched him go, then started through the woods on his own. He would have enjoyed the dog's company, but this was his first attempt retrieving webbing for his bowstrings, and he could not risk something going wrong. Rain kept a steady pace for most of the morning, a light jog on a game trail. The air was moist and cool under the canopy of trees. Rain inhaled with a deep breath as he listened to the sounds of the forest. A dirt track led through dense woods on either side. This particular path was used frequently, and it showed. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. If he held the rhythm, he could run for hours, especially if he was familiar with the trail. He had been on this trail with some of the Woodbridge hunters, and every so often, Rain would glance up to see if any of them were perched in a tree. They had their favorite spots, but he had passed those a while ago. He dreaded the thought of being perched in a tree for hours. Such a waste of time. Rain preferred to be on the ground, chasing his prey. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Rain had been running most of the morning, but now, as he almost reached his mark, thought it best to slow down and conserve energy. Grabbing some of the dried meat out of his pack, he decided this would also be a good time to answer the noises in his belly. Rain had filled his water skin at a spring that most of the woodsmen use this far out. It was the last place he thought he would run into someone from the village. He knew all the Woodbridge hunters, and they had just had a successful hunt within the week. Knowing their habits, no one would be out this far so soon. That thought made him pause. It was mid-morning, and he would be getting close to his destination. Rain took his unstrung bow off his pack and stepped over the piece, locking it on his foot to bend it. In one fluid motion, the bowstring was fixed in place, and he was off again. At first, the thought of being alone relieved him, but then a wave of fear crept over him. He paused and instantly became flush. What if something goes wrong? No one knew where he was. Too many scenarios went through his mind. It was not unheard of for him to be gone half the day. He was always out gathering materials or helping others with odd jobs. Fen wouldn't notice until he missed dinner. Fen had given Rain more independence than most young men his age. Maybe it was because Rain wasn't his real son, or maybe Fen was distancing himself because Rain would have to soon leave for the Cairn Mountain, since he had recently reached his 16th birthday. Fen constantly complained that the Watchers would come for Rain and take him away for 3 years. Rain pushed the thoughts from his mind and focused on the task at hand. The trail became an incline, which meant he was getting close. The muscles in his legs felt strained as he moved up the path. The cool air from the cover of trees turned to sun-filled heat. He could hear the faint rush of water crashing on rocks. Moisture hit his nostrils, and as Rain reached the top of the hill, the sight made him again question his decision to come. The Silk Forest, home of the spiders, lay in front of him. The only barrier between him and the massive white-lined trees was the Tarsus River. No one who went into that forest came out. Rain realized he was holding his breath and had notched an arrow poised to draw. From where he stood, the trees opened up to a clearing with a winding game trail down to the embankment. On the far side of the river were streams of white webs shooting in every direction. If he squinted, he could see trees and rocks underneath the webbing. Looking at the forest as a whole, it was sheets of white. He had laid eyes on this place only once before. A hunter brought him close by accident while following a wounded deer. Rain surveyed the area for movement. It was midday, and the warmth of the sun was beating down. Spiders were more active in the heat, and he berated himself for not arriving earlier. There were no signs of spiders anywhere, but a fly might think the same thing seconds before being entangled. Nonetheless, the absence of the creatures was a good sign. The river winded back and forth and was partially fed by a waterfall coming down from the mountain to the north. This is where he focused his attention. If he could get some of the webs that were wet from the mist, it would make this a lot easier. The webs were for his bowstrings. If he could gather enough of the rare silk, he could sell his bows for 5 times the price. The extra coin would allow Fen to hire a helper after he had gone. Before crossing the river, he wanted to be sure nothing would be waiting for him on the other side. So, Rain climbed down and sat on the shore, unmoving. After a few minutes, there had been no movement, no sounds but his own heartbeat and water crashing on the rocks. He climbed down the embankment and slowly waded into the water. It was cold and fast-moving, but not so much where he was having difficulty crossing. Rain wanted to keep his packs dry, so he was glad it only came up to his waist at the deepest point. As he reached the other side, he moved as silently as he could, and drew his knife. If he could get 5 or 6 good lengths of silk, the trip would be worth it. The webs were difficult to cut, even though he had sharpened his knife the night before. Some were almost as thick as a finger, and they went in every direction. Finally cutting them free, he doused the webs in the water, then stuffed them in his pack. Rain looked around, half expecting to see hundreds of spiders looking back at him. Still, nothing. He waited another moment and went right back to it. Finding strands that were not part of the main web was difficult. They all seemed to be intertwined. If he disturbed the webs, the spiders would surely sense it. Rain followed the strains and caught a glimpse of an animal carcass. He had heard the stories from the hunters of deer that would get a leg caught. The spiders came out of nowhere and in numbers. One bite would slow the deer down and eventually paralyze it. Then they would web it up, bring it back in the forest, or hang it from a nearby tree, and come back for it later. It took him a bit longer than he'd anticipated, but he filled his pack and waded back across the Tarsus. He reached the other side and sat on one of the big rocks to dry himself in the sun. Rain watched the forest for a while, pondering why he heard so many warnings of this place. The white-wisped trees almost looked peaceful. He closed his eyes to embrace the moment, listening to the sounds around him. Other than the faint sound of the waterfall in the distance, he heard not a bird, a cricket, anything. The familiar sounds of the forest were absent. Rain opened his eyes and looked across the river again in sudden unease. Gathering his things, he turned to begin the climb up the riverbank. Rain climbed from rock to rock and was just about to the top grassy part of the embankment when he saw it. He wasn't sure how he didn't notice it before. The spider was clinging to the underside of the riverbank, not far from where he stood, and as Rain got close, it quickly moved to the top. It was not as large as the rumors, this one only being about waist high, but Rain froze. Its thick legs were covered in brown hair and moved with precision. There were 4 sets of eyes, one larger pair predominantly in front, and in their blackness, Rain could see his own reflection. They remained frozen for what seemed an eternity, and Rain's fear slowly changed to instinct. Realizing he had his bow in his hand, he wondered if he could get a shot off. The spider was only about 10 paces away, as long as it didn't move. As if the spider was reading his thoughts, its legs began to recoil, poised to strike. Rain's hand went to his quiver at the exact moment the spider came at him. He took off running sideways across the rocks and let the arrow fly. The shaft hit one of the spider's legs, and it stumbled briefly before resuming the attack. Rain took his eyes off the beast for a moment, making sure of his footing as he climbed up the bank. Reaching the top, Rain stood up, about to spring into a full run, when the weight from the spider hit him from behind. Knocked to the ground, Rain rolled to his back. He lost his second arrow for a moment. It had fallen to his side, where he quickly grabbed it again and notched it. The spider paused. Rain sat up, pulling back his arrow and waiting for the best shot. The beast was slowly creeping closer. As soon as its head cleared the grass, it bit Rain's leg and began to pull him back toward the river. Rain buried his arrow deep in the spider's head. It released him and went lifeless. Rain's leg pulsed. He had to get to the forest. Barely getting to his feet, he notched another arrow, looked around one last time, and started home. Entering the woods brought a wave of relief. He was not really sure why, as the spiders could easily come in after him. Still, the trees gave him a sense of security. Rain stopped and sat on a fallen tree for a moment to look at his leg. The bite had been painful, but he must have scraped his lower calf on a rock as he was being pulled. Blood soaked his boot. Rain removed his shirt, cut it into strips, and tied it around the wound, doing his best to slow the bleeding. The bite was near the top of his calf. It did not appear to be an issue putting weight on it, but he needed to run, and run hard. He was not sure how quickly the venom worked. Testing his leg again, Rain got to his feet. His bandaging was not ideal, but it would work. For now. Running on it did not worsen the pain, but the throbbing made him aware the poison was at work. He tried to put it out of his mind. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3, breathe. Rain kept his pace steady, though his leg now ached with every footfall. The sting of sweat crept into his eyes. He tried to wipe it away. He passed several familiar landmarks, but he was still far from home and unsure how much longer he could run. Rain finally paused at a natural spring, a favorite stop for the village hunters. But no one was there. Rain decided to use this break to clean his leg. The water felt good on the wound, but the bleeding had not stopped, and the bite was swelling. It was at least another few hours at a steady run to Woodbridge. Too long, too far, he thought. He already felt so tired. Why did he risk doing this? For some bowstrings? His mind wandered. Rain made most of the bows and arrows used in the village. He was a better shot than anyone in Woodbridge, too. It was a skill he took great pride in, and he always felt safe when he had his bow. Rain had received that bow years ago. He had several, but this one was special. This one was a gift. Years ago, an elf came to seek Fenn's help. Rain did not remember exactly why, but the elf stayed at the village for several days while Fenn worked at the forge on an item for him. Elves did not come to Woodbridge very often, and if they did, it was only to pass through. In the days waiting on the blacksmith, the elf spent the time carving a long piece of wood into a bow. Rain took interest in the elf's pastime and began to create a bow of his own. The elf took to Rain and his interest and guided him to make a bow in the elven fashion. Rain worked tirelessly at his newfound craft, and as their time came near to an end, the two each had a bow of their own. Fenn had finished his work, and Rain went to fetch the elf at the Huntsman's Rest where he was staying. When Rain found him, he was hunched over the elf's newly made bow, whispering. Rain could not make out what the elf was saying, but it seemed like he was speaking with the bow. Rain sensed he was intruding, and began to back out of the room when the elf spoke softly. "Come." Rain let out a sigh and started back into the room. The elf motioned for Rain's own bow, which was slung over his back. He handed it to him, and the elf began to inspect it. Checking the curves, feeling the string, he looked over every inch. "This is well made." He paused and looked Rain in the eye as he handed the bow back to him. "And the perfect size for you." The elf then handed his own bow to Rain, and as he did, held Rain's gaze. His long white hair accentuated his light-colored eyes. "For when you become a young man." Taking it from the elf, he felt a tingle in his hand as he touched the bow, and looked at it in awe. The elf then sought out Fen, gathered his things, and moved on. From that day forward, Rain worked on perfecting his bows, and with a few exceptions, Rain had made bows for every hunter in Woodbridge. Now, the bow he had used as a model, his favorite given to him by an elf, had been lost. He forced himself, took one step, then two. 1, 2, 3, breathe. 1, 2, 3. Darkness crept to the corner of his eyes. Rain's run had become a stumble of awkward steps. His body felt strange. His heart raced, and a tingling feeling coursed through him. He battled to keep his eyes open. Rain felt a presence near him. He glanced sideways and behind him, then almost fell. His head was heavy, and a ringing in his ears was overtaking his senses. He didn't see anyone, but it was almost as if someone was running with him. The presence grew closer and closer. It had to be the fever. Spinning around to locate the stranger, Rain's knees buckled and he fell. With blurred vision, he looked up at the sky through the trees. There was a rustle of leaves near him, and a voice was speaking. Rain caught a glimpse of a figure coming to kneel over him as he lost consciousness. Rain woke to a dim room only lit by a lone candle on a table. He did not move, but wearily looked about to get his bearings. It was his house. How did he... The thought trailed off. Thinking for a moment it had all been a dream, the pulsing pain in his leg reminded him that it was not. He lifted his head up and looked around the room. There was a strong smell of herbs, but he could not place it. Immediately, his head pounded, and he realized there was a damp cloth sliding down his forehead. "Don't you dare try and get up," came a soft but commanding voice. The woman caught the cloth and placed it in a wooden bowl next to his bed. It was Agatha. Agatha was everyone's mother. If any illness struck the village, she was the one the villagers turned to. She held a soft spot for Fen, and Fen had feelings for her as well, but the two never showed it. Rain wished he could have met his real mother and father, but he could not ask for better parents. Agatha brought a chair over to his bedside and was inspecting Rain's leg. "Not sure what this is, but it seems to be helping." She was pointing to a greenish substance that was placed on the bite. "Whew, it smells foul." Her nose wrinkled. How?" Rain started, but Agatha cut him off. "How indeed?" It was more a silenced yell than a whisper. "You had Fen worried sick. What were you doing out there?" Rain looked toward the door. His quiver hung there, but his bow and pack were missing. "My bow," he began. My pack." Then the vague memory of the figure kneeling over him as he lost consciousness came to mind. There was a man. He was sure he had been robbed. He eased his head back on the pillow. There was no reason he shouldn't have been. He was careless. He should be grateful the man found him at all. He could have left him for dead. Agatha sat back down and was wringing out the cloth to place it back on his head. "Yes, he brought you back near dusk. Fen was looking for you when he came out of the woods." She began to wipe his forehead off. He still felt feverish, but he could tell it was much better. "Fen asked me to come. Said you'd been bitten by a spider. By the time I got here, you were in bed, and the man was mixing that salve that's on your leg." "Who is he? Where is he now? And Fen?" Rain asked. "He asked me some questions about you and your parents. He seemed to think on it and then left. He didn't tell me his name." She had wrung out the cloth one last time and placed it on his head. "Fen was here for a while, but I sent him home to rest. You've been out for nearly a day and a half. It's almost dawn, and I'm sure he will be returning soon. But you must rest." She was right. His eyes were already closed. He wished to stay awake and get some answers, but his weariness overtook him. "You're lucky to be alive." Fenn stood in the doorway, his voice stern and even. He brought some water to the bedside table and motioned Rain to drink. "Why were you hunting near the Silk Forest?" He paused for an answer that did not come. Rain lay back down on his pillows. "Who brought me back?" Fenn took the chair at the side of the bed, flipped it around to straddle the back. "Oh, strange fellow, that one. Says he carried you here all the way from the Silk Forest. Stayed with you while I ran for Agatha and tended to your leg. Then he was off the way he came, in a hurry." Fenn's attention went to Rain's leg, and he was about to touch the salve, but stopped. Agatha would not be pleased if she had to reapply the salve. Fenn did his best to stay out of her crosshairs. "Did he bring back my pack and bow?" Rain glanced at the empty space near the door. He was almost afraid to ask. "He brought you," Fenn said flatly. "I was not concerned about your things." Fenn continued standing up from the chair. He was not one for staying in one spot for too long. "Do you remember what happened? Was he there when you were attacked?" I remember running," Rain said. He did not want to give too much information. The spider surprised me at the edge of the wood. I shot it, but not before it got my leg." Fenn looked at his leg and then toward the door. "You must have dropped your bow along the way." They gave each other a saddened look. Fenn made his way to the table, where Agatha had left them some of her sugar biscuits. He put one in the pocket of his apron and began eating another. "Well, at least your fever is down. That spider bite must not have been too deep. I've seen grown men paralyzed for days with wounds half that size." Fenn came over to stand beside Rain again. "They should burn that whole forest down." He trailed off, gazing at Rain's leg almost hypnotically. He snapped out of it after a moment and moved toward the front door. "Aggie said she was coming back to check on you. I was going to wait, but you look as if you'll be up again in no time. Rest up, and I will see you at supper." Fenn was right. Rain's leg did feel better than it did when he awoke earlier. After quickly testing it on the floor, he elevated it again. He didn't want to put too much weight on it, but he was convinced whatever was on his wound was making a difference. Rain lay back on his pillows again, looking at the spot where his bow usually was kept. He went over the events in his mind, replaying them over and over, until sleep again overcame him.